Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's session on Twinmotion using SketchUp for landscape and garden design. My name is Paul Hensey. I am the principal designer at a small landscape design and landscape engineering company based down in Sussex. And this afternoon, I'm really just going to be showing you a simple workflow for using a SketchUp model, taking it through into Twinmotion and starting to use the assets and the techniques that are available in Twinmotion to create some form of visualization. This afternoon's session is being recorded and you will receive an email after today's session, which will link to a download for access to the video recording. In addition, at this moment, Twinmotion are offering, or in fact, one of the resellers of Twinmotion, CADsoft Solutions, are offering a discount. So if you decide that you want to go ahead, or you've seen something that is of interest in Twinmotion for you, then at the moment it's 50% off. But I don't think that extends into September, so it's something to think about. Now, in front of you, or in front of me, I've got the Twinmotion webpage, which is where you download it from. This is on the Epic Games website. So Twinmotion is owned and updated by Epic Games, who run another program called Unreal, which you may have heard of. But Twinmotion is sort of a simplified workflow technique for quick architectural visualization. You need to sign up for an Epic Games account in order to access. And once you've accessed and logged into the Epic Games website, you get a window like this. You've got the Unreal Engine at one end, and right across the top of my screen, you can see that Twinmotion is one of the tabs. And I can launch it from here. And I can also access a trial version. And I can also, for some reason, go back and access some of the older versions. But really, Twinmotion went through an update about 10 days ago. So we're now currently on 2020.2. We're not going to be launching from Twinmotion from the Epic Games website. We've got a better way of doing that. So I'm going to bring in a SketchUp model that I have sort of prepared, and I haven't really done that much to it. And I'll explain all that in a second. So let me just close that and bring in SketchUp. Now, before we go any further, I think I'm a representative user. We're a small landscape design practice. There's a couple of us here, and we use Apple Macs. We don't use anything really special. We don't use Apple Mac Pros. We have really standard AMD off the shelf as they came with the computers, graphics cards. We do run 32 gigabytes of RAM, but really it's nothing clever. If you go onto some of the resources that you'll find on places like YouTube, a word of warning, you'll see people doing amazing things with Twinmotion, and frequently they'll be using what are called RTX graphics cards. And these are very powerful, fast graphics cards. And you may wonder why you can't achieve the same results or at the same speed, or why Twinmotion keeps crashing. And that's because you might be trying it on a regular laptop or MacBook or PC or some form of desktop. Twinmotion will run on these, but it will not respond as fast with a less professional rated graphics card. That's not to say that you need to go out and get one. I manage perfectly well on a standard Apple Mac. Okay, now I'm going to warn you, because this is an honest broadcast. So we're live, and I'm going to be using Twinmotion. A problem with Twinmotion, and it's a glitch, and it is improving. It's improved with 2020, and I'm hoping it will improve later in the year, is that sometimes Twinmotion crashes. And it may crash for no apparent reason. It runs over your broadband connection. So having a good broadband connection does help. But certainly today, because I'm using Twinmotion and we have this broadcast, it puts a burden on my broadband connection. And I have a good broadband connection. So I am going to apologize in advance because Twinmotion, I would be very surprised if it doesn't crash. And if it crashes once, it may crash again. Now, when I'm using it not broadcasting, then it doesn't crash that often, and it is crashing much less. It is a frustration. It's worth persisting with. I don't mind because actually I've learned to save very frequently. So I'm just giving you an honest opinion as to one of the downsides of using the software. I think the upsides more than outweigh that. And as I said, I think it is improving. Right, here is a simple, it's a fictitious garden. I've put in various pieces from various projects to give at least a larger space. And I've done certain things to this model. And the workflow for me is I will have created an initial SketchUp model that is probably very rough. I'm not really paying attention to there being stray geometry, not really paying attention to having grouped things correctly. I'm trying to get a concept together as quickly as possible. And if I switch on my textures, then you can see what this model consists. And once I've created a SketchUp model that I think this proposal is worth putting in front of a client, and therefore I am going to put it through Twinmotion and see how they react to the visuals, I would at that point create a copy of my SketchUp model. And that copy becomes my presentation model. I will save that into a folder called visualizations or presentation, and I'll give it the appropriate date. Because this model then gets changed and it becomes different to the actual original SketchUp model. And what do I do to it? Frequently, I will strip it of most of the textures. And I'll explain those in a minute. I will also start items. So Twinmotion is going to give me good textures. It's going to give me access to a library of plant material. It's going to give me lights. It's going to give me environmental rendering. It's going to give me water. Now I need the geometry inside of SketchUp because Twinmotion will paint over that geometry. But I'm really concentrating on the geometry only and not necessarily on the actual textures that I'm going to use. Now there are some exceptions to that, and I will go through those now. For the sake of showing what happens, I've kept into SketchUp from the 3D warehouse, and I've also got some plants over here in the 3D warehouse. These are low polygon. These are about 200 kilobytes each. So I'm not trying to be clever, very high polygon models through SketchUp. Get onto plants inside Twinmotion, but at the moment it is limited. That's not to say that you can't create really interesting visualizations, but they've just released an additional load of shrubs and trees, 15 or so, and I expect them to keep doing that through the year. So you're getting in assets associated to it will expand probably quite rapidly. Now, I've put in some objects from the warehouse. In addition to my trees, I've put in this bench. This bench was I brought in this little piece of sculpture from the 3D warehouse. It's got like a grainy concrete texture. And I've brought in some fern, which you can see down here. I've made pergola, and I've put these light positions because inside Twinmotion we can introduce lights. And these give me a target to put the lights into. So those will be overhead lights of the pergola. A couple of lights dotted, got positions, but I've got a couple of wall lights. And what we're going to do, try and create a night scene within for SketchUp, but within Twinmotion. Now, when you export from SketchUp to Twinmotion, you can ask it to collapse the model, the geometry, either by the way it is grouped or by textures. And textures is really my preferred method because it means that all surfaces that have the same texture get treated as a single object when they're inside Twinmotion, which means applying textures and controlling them within Twinmotion is so much easier and quicker. But that also means that if you paint something that's gray or white, everything that is gray or white gets the same texture. So what you need to do in in SketchUp is to start breaking up or differentiating different surfaces. So if you've got a paved surface, then give it a unique paved texture. I hate this paved texture, by the way, but I've applied it simply to show you what happens when it goes into Twinmotion. We will change it in Twinmotion. It just means that this particular surface has a unique texture. And when I change it, no other surface will change. I've applied a water texture to the pool. And what that basically convert to a water to do is put a large rock inside the pool, and that's where my rock is going to sit. I started to play around with some textures around these tree pits, attempting to create a resemblance of paving, but we may change that inside Twinmotion. The bottom of my tree pits is going to have a rough bark texture, and I've got no idea what that will look like, but Twinmotion gives me several options, I know. So what I've done is make my bark areas a different color. It doesn't have to be actually bark texture from SketchUp or from an outside library. I've just painted it a color. And that works really well because it means I don't miss applying textures because I've got these glaring blocks of primary color shouting at me. The outside perimeter of my pool will be a texture of paving. Again, not quite sure what it'll be, but I've just made it unique and different to anything else. Then we've got our planted areas, and I've made this green color because these will be perennial plants. And then I may still make this very bright green area the same texture, but because I've separated it, I've got the option of having a different texture in this area. The other thing you can do in Twinmotion is paint plants. You can click on a surface and it will distribute trees and shrubs and plants over that textured surface. So if your textured surfaces are separated, it means that you can apply different densities or different types of plants to different colored zones. So again, I may decide to merge these two inside Twinmotion, but at the moment I've got the option because they're different colors. Now, the other thing I've done is for the majority of surfaces, I've just painted standard off the library SketchUp textures. But I've also on SketchUp textures from outside. In this case, I've used the SketchUp Texture Club library, which is free. And I've painted on their standard resolution textures, res, but they've got a whole lot of walls and there's about 15, 20,000 textures in the library. So you can see the quite nice textures. And again, I've painted these on, and here's another one, simply so that you can see decent textures when they're imported, whether you want to keep them or whether you want to replace them with something else inside Twinmotion. Got a couple more lights over here, and that's about it. Oh, one more thing. Sorry, two more things. The building has been as a simple block. So these are just rectangles that I've created a pitched roof on. I've applied a standard library slate roof, and I took site pic in quite good resolution, and then I've pasted them onto the side of the building. The light conditions changed between photographs, so I've had to merge some of the pictures. That I'm not actually building the model backdrop to the garden. Doesn't need to be very high resolution, but if you go to site and take pictures, it does resolution pictures, because within SketchUp you can certainly edit out or the resolution and reduce it so that it lowers the file size of the model. I found is very useful to do, and that is paint things like timber inside SketchUp. We have lots of timber effects and styles inside Twinmotion, but one of the problems is if I apply, if I collapse this model by material, all of these surfaces become one entity. And when I apply inside Twinmotion, reapply a texture, the texture will go up the legs and it will still point upwards as it goes horizontally, which is something that irritates me enormously in architectural visualizations, where the grain of the material is going in the wrong direction. Is take a texture from the SketchUp Texture Club, applied it correctly, and then made a copy and pivoted the object so that it's in the horizontal position. And now those textures will come through and they'll be half decent. So not quite as good as Twinmotion textures, but they're representative and direction, so it does save me some effort. Sometimes Twinmotion may flip the textures, so there may be a bit of editing. Now, Twinmotion. And that's very easy, because when you access or download Twinmotion, what it does is it installs a plugin. And so using the usual way of adding a plugin into SketchUp, which is you go to the window, extension manager, and I'll just bring that over, and it will list all the extensions that you've got loaded, whether they're active or not, but right at the bottom it will say install extension. And if you go to your usual downloads folder, you will see where Unreal and Twinmotion little plugin has been installed. You install extension, click on the downloaded file, and it will automatically install inside SketchUp. And what it does is installs this little icon. So there are three little purple icons. The right-hand one is really just opens up a whole sort of a support community where you can get articles and discussion. By far the best source of information for Twinmotion is YouTube. There are lots and lots of videos. The problem is you need to know a little bit about it to understand how to start using it. Otherwise, they can be quite baffling. But once you've got a little bit of knowledge, then you're away. The second icon, the middle one, is really all about synchronization settings. So I'm using Twinmotion materials to replace where possible, and I'm merging by material, and that's it. Everything else is, I've left it as a default, in fact. There are things you can do about fixing textures, but unless there's a problem, don't worry about it. So that leaves us with this little eyeball icon, and that's the one I'm going to press now. And when I click that, it opens up Twinmotion. And it usually takes a few seconds, but now that's synchronizing my SketchUp model into Twinmotion. It's a new project. So I'm going to say OK. There's a navigation hint. Let me just activate Twinmotion again. It tells you how to navigate, but I'll explain that in a minute. And I'm just going to close that down, and it will synchronize and open up your model inside Twinmotion. And there it is. Now, I'm just going to minimize my SketchUp background. A couple of things to do first. And that one is save. So before we do anything, and in anticipation of some pain ahead, I'm going to File, Save As, and then it's going to ask me what we're going to call it. So I'm going to call this the Elmtech Twinmotion training model. And I'll put that, as I really shouldn't, I'm going to put that on my desktop because it will mean I can access it very quickly when things go wrong. And then I'm going to say save. And right, so we're now saved. You'll notice, well, you might, as we go, right at the top of my screen, it says Twinmotion 20.2. And you'll notice it comes up with little asterisks after a while. And the little asterisk is really simply indicating that your file is not current. You're using it, but it hasn't been saved. When you save, then the little asterisk goes away. Now, here we go. The first thing to notice is Twinmotion has, for the majority, honored the textures of SketchUp. So if it's a unique SketchUp texture, then it's brought through. So all of my photographs on my building have remained, my greens and my brick wall. So let's go and have a look around the model. So let's start over with the benches. Now, the way I'm navigating is relatively simple. There are lots of ways of navigating, but I'm using the center wheel of my mouse, which scrolls in and out to zoom. If I hold down the Command or the Alt key on a Mac, then that allows me to pan around the screen up and down. And if I hold down the Shift key, then I can rotate. So if I'm just going to zoom into this chair, and you can see all those textures have come through. And if I look at the floor, you'll notice that suddenly my floor is not the texture that we used to have. So wall in the background, it has really come through very nicely. It doesn't have a three-dimensional depth to it as Twinmotion textures do, but it's a pretty good texture and quite like that. And then our little wall at the back is also quite good. Remember, these sorts of textures are in the background, so you won't really be inspecting them that much. I'm just going to go across, and you can see that we've got our plants. Now, they were very simple inside SketchUp, and they've remained that way, but they're not bad. They don't really have that much character to them, but they're three-dimensional. So when we start to add other plants, then these could be quite useful. And I've added these particular plants because at the moment, Twinmotion doesn't have very many decorative perennials and shrubs. So things like these grasses are quite useful to have. I'm just going to swing around and look at the tree. Now, the tree was a very low polygon tree, and that is okay. You can sort of see how it's made. It's like little flat photographs stuck on these invisible planes, and it looks okay, but even the trunks are 2D flat. So we can decide to replace that if we want. And I'm just going to pull out, and let's go and have a look at the pergola, and you'll see that the texture on the wood is now all going the right way, which is reassuring. Sometimes I've had problems where I've had to go back and reset it inside SketchUp, but here the texture all looks pretty good. Now, one thing to note, as in the real world, there are no black lines around your geometry. So all lines that, even if you had loads and loads of strange, stray geometry inside SketchUp, that all gets hidden because you can't see those lines when it comes through into Twinmotion. And remember that the geometry has been collapsed so that if I click my tree, for instance, you'll notice that all of the canopy gets selected because it is all one material. If I pick my my green material that is planting, it automatically picks up all of the similar groups. So they're all treated as one entity. So we're going to use that to our advantage. Now, before we go any further, sometimes the navigation inside Twinmotion can, especially at the beginning, you're a little bit unfamiliar, and even if you're familiar with it, it can end up sticking a little bit. So it's always worth, right at the beginning, before you start adding in additional geometry, is create a point of view that's quite close to something that is useful. So here I'm in quite close to my garden, and I'm just going to click in the sky. I'm clicking away from my geometry so everything is deselected. And I'm going to go down to the bottom of the screen. And what I'm going to do is, the first thing is create a saved view. And obviously, if you're familiar with creating scenes inside SketchUp, then whilst those scenes are not honored inside Twinmotion, you're going to repeat and create your own scenes. So I'm going to go down to the second to bottom icon, which is one that's called Media. And it's got a whole load of icons, and we'll go through the interface in a minute. And I'm going to pick the first one that says Image. And it's big arrow that says click here to create your first image. So if I simply hit the big button, it creates a scene. And I can have as many of these as I want. So having set up a scene, I'm now going to go back up and immediately save. So now, even if we crash out, or if I get lost and I'm suddenly pointing at the sky, or I've rotated around and I can't find my model, if I come back down to Media, and let's just pretend I swing around and I'm lost. If I come back to and pick image 1, then it resets my point of view. In the background, you'll notice that we've got a strange skyline. In this case, it's got some buildings. And these are things that we can change. We've got a blue sky, and we've got a ground that's made up of herringbone bricks. And you can just about see that in the bottom of the pool. Twinmotion has also applied its own water, which is obviously much better than SketchUp water. But even so, we're going to improve on that. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. And the first thing to note is how your model has been placed. So if I just rotate round a little bit and come out a little bit more. So your model is hovering over the ground, just a fraction. So this is the default ground. And this is a little gizmo. And if you're familiar with other programs, or you use things like vertex tools inside SketchUp, you'll be familiar with how these gizmos work. And it's sort of like a cursor point that has lots of functionality within it. And this little gizmo relates to the ground level. So if I click on it, or I hover over the arrow, if I drag it up, try again, drag it up, the ground moves one way or the other. So I'm just going to drag it down a little bit more, because what was happening was that herringbone was intruding into the bottom of my swimming pool, well, my pond. So now I've got a true geometry in the base of my pool. I'm not worried about there being a herringbone. You can change it to grass or terrain, but I tend to make my models slightly wider with more context around them, even if it's just flat ground, because I'm probably going to put some vegetation and trees that will hide the surrounding area. Okay, so let's talk about the interface of Twinmotion. We've got 4 zones. We've got the big graphic window in the middle, which is where your model is being presented. We've got a banner that goes across the bottom that has 5 icons down the left-hand side. And this is where you will access or control actions. Will really all about clicking buttons and moving sliders. Up on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got a little white triangle, and then we've got the same on the right-hand side of the screen. So we'll go to the right-hand side of the screen first, and if I click it, out pops a list. And this is a list of all of the things in your model. And at the moment, this long list is all about materials because we asked Twinmotion to collapse by material type. So it didn't bring in any objects, it brought in various materials. But if I click on my tree, for instance, it highlights that this is called the pagoda dogwood. If I next to it is a little eye icon, and I can switch off the canopy. Whoops, if I go the other way, of the tree. And if I click on the stem of the tree, or get a little, there we go. That's known as beige, so I can switch that off. So I can switch off objects, but I'm really switching off the color material. We'll keep those on because we'll compare them to the Twinmotion trees. We will add objects inside and materials inside Twinmotion shortly, and they will start to appear at the bottom of this list. But for now, we're just going to close that down. If I go to the right-hand side of the screen, this is where the more interesting stuff sits. And this is where our libraries are. And you've got these high-level libraries. So we've got things like objects, which is various types of furniture. We've got lights. We've got vehicles. We've got people. We've got some general tools which don't fit into the others categories. You can create your own user library. We're not really going to get into that today, but you can bring in objects that you purchase or acquire from other websites. Usually they come in as FBX files. It's not as simple as some people make out because the object and the textures sometimes get mismatched and you have to paste them all back together inside things like Photoshop. Unless you're confident doing that, then stick with bringing objects in with SketchUp or using the online library bits that we've got here. But the two that you're going to use the most are the two at the top, which are materials and vegetation and landscape. So what we're going to do is immediately add vegetation and landscape. And when I click that, I get a whole load of options. So I can add rocks and something called detail grasses. I can add some bushes, which are slightly larger plants, grasses. But to start with, I'm going to go into the tree library. So I've got a load of tree pits here. And I'm going to position myself, and we're going to add the same tree, certainly to these four, maybe a different tree down the side. So if I click on the tree icon, I got a whole load of trees there, sometimes given the correct name, sometimes they're just a bit generic. So you're really looking for form. There's lots of trees here. You get a little indication of the size by the little person icon. It's a fair list. I'm going to pick Persian ironwood, so that would be it's okay, probably a little bit bushy, so maybe I'm going to pick this one at the bottom. So it's called the cinnabar or a chinaberry tree. But if I drag it and bring it into the screen, you see that I get a tree. And if I hover over the geometry, it will place itself on the geometry. It's not like SketchUp where it hovers and you can get it up in space. These objects place themselves correctly. So if I move my geometry onto, let's say, the pergola or the wall, the tree actually knows it's a tree and it should be vertical. But I can bring it up or put it on the water and it moves at different heights. But here we're going to go into the tree pit. And I just let go. And there's my tree. And immediately at the bottom of the screen appears a little menu bar relating to this tree. So let me just bring this down a little bit. Now, I can play around with all of these settings. You're probably not going to need to, but for instance, if I click on the age of the tree, I can make it bigger or I can make it smaller. And you'll notice that what happens is the tree just doesn't get bigger or smaller in the same shape. It actually represents a form as the age of the tree does. So a young tree is usually a little contorted, and as it gets bigger, we end up with lots of side branches, etc. And so I'm just going to go with a mid-sized tree. Now, I want to make a copy of that tree in a very similar way to SketchUp. You click on the base of the tree. We have this little gizmo. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and drag a copy of the tree. And I'm going to place it in the next tree pit and watch what happens. I get this reference window pops up and it's asking me, do I want a copy, which is an exact copy, or do I want an instance, which is the computer saying, I know it's the same model, but I'm going to give you a variation of the original model without actually physically putting another tree into your model. So I'm going to say instance, and it's placed a similar tree, but actually it's completely different. So it's the same species of tree at the same age, but it's just randomly given me a completely different configuration. So this is, well, if you've used planting inside SketchUp, my mistake, I didn't press the Shift key there, so I'm going to hold down the Shift key and place that one there. I'm going to ask it for an instance again, and it gives me a variation. And so I'm now going to do a final one, and there we go, make an instance. Now, an instance also has another characteristic, which is very similar to being a component in SketchUp. If I now play around with the age of the tree, because all of these are instances, then they all change relative to any changes that I make. A copy would have been a detached copy, and it would have only altered a single version of the tree. Now, these are really, if I zoom in, sort of very realistic type trees. You can see, I can zoom in, great bark, really nice leaves. They cast really nice shadows. I can just keep zooming in. You get very nice shadows. We can change all of the shadows and things. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to save. Now, if I was teaching you SketchUp, one of the things I would do is tell you to create geometry, bring geometry into your model, make it into a group, and then put it onto its own layer or tag. And if you're not using it, switch it off, because all you're doing is adding a burden. And the same goes in Twinmotion. If you've got a great, if you've got a lot of memory, RAM, 32, 64, 128, and then you've got a great graphics card, then fine, you can have everything open. But for most of us, that isn't feasible. So I would go over to my project list, and you can see right at the bottom, it says that I've got Chinaberry tree 4 times. So I'm going to just click on the little dots next to the name, and I'm going to go right to the top, and it says create a new container. For container, read the word folder. And I'm going to create a container called, in fact, this might work. I'm going to go and try this at the top. New container. Yes, okay, so I'm going to call this one trees. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the trees and make it my active container. And then I'm just going to drag my trees into my active container. I don't need that one, because what I can do is then I can switch off my trees. And that is one of the things that will help keep your model flowing very well, very smoothly, but also hopefully start to prevent some of the crashes, because it's when you've got lots and lots of geometry being processed. Trees aren't that bad. It's when you start applying plants, and in particular, when we start to add things like grasses. So I'm now going to add some textures. We may not get to add that many plants to this, but you'll get the idea. So I'm going to go and add some textures. So we're going to start off with these red zones because they're starting to shout at me. And I'm going to go up to my library. It remembers that I'm on tree, so I need to go back up, and I need to go back up again to materials. If I click materials, I've got a whole load of different categories, but there's one called ground, and ground is either natural materials or man-made. So we're going to go with a natural material, and we've got various types of grass, and then we've got these forest grade sort of ground effects. So I'm probably going to go with this one, and you simply drag the material and let it go over what you want. And at the bottom, you see that a whole load of little sliders appear relating to how you can control that material. So you can change color, reflection, but the thing you're probably going to change most is scale. And I'm probably going to just make that a little bit chunkier. And there we go. That all looks pretty good. And that's changed in all of the same tree pits. Maybe I want to make that a bit darker, and the way you do that is you simply hit the color, and then you've got a darken command, so that just makes it a little bit, and then you simply say OK, and there it's a bit darker. Paving. So let's go and put different kinds of paving down. So this time it's ground, but it's man-made, and I've got all kinds of asphalt and cast concretes, and we're going to go with let's go with a rough cobblestone, maybe not too rough. I can't quite remember the one. Let's go with this rough cobblestone, and I simply drag that and place it on the ground. Again, it doesn't look quite right, so maybe I'm just going to play with the slider and make it a bit bigger. Now I've got these other areas, so I'm going to apply a different texture around my pool. So I think I've got some larger paving slabs down here. Let's go with square cobblestone. And if I apply that, and again, just play around with the again, I haven't quite got my joints. Now at the bottom of scale, there's a little button that says more. And if I hit more, it means I can adjust the axes. So I can move my texture in one axis or another. And I probably need to stretch it a little bit on my, just so that I can, maybe a bit more. There we go. Anyway, you get the idea that you can play around with your different types of textures. Now let's go straight into water. Water is one of the big, I mean, water used to look great, so I never had a problem with water, but water is one of the things that they actually improved on the 2020. So I scroll down to water, and I've got these different kinds of pools. I've got pools, rivers, lakes, sea. I wouldn't go by the name, it's whatever you think looks good. So I'm gonna go, let's say, with a pool. Now, this is a swimming pool, so that's not possibly gonna give me what I want. But if I apply river, you get that nice black effect, and it's got motion in it, and maybe it's moving a little bit too much. So I can maybe go to more, and I can change the flow speed down considerably, almost to 0. And then I can also change the wave height, so it's a little bit calmer, maybe the wave size. And now you get that nice rippling effect. It also is reflective. Can you see? It's just giving that reflection of the buildings. Now I said that we were going to put a rock in. So I'm going to go up, and I'm going to go to my library. because one of the in vegetation and landscapes, I've got rock as an option. Rocks have all got different sizes, so we're going to put that rock just happened to look okay. Now, at the moment, it's sitting on top of not on top of the water, but on top of the geometry. So you might like that, or you might want to scale it. Now, this is my object, and I don't have any options available on the bottom of the screen. But what I do have is options available on my gizmo. So I can move my object up or down. I can just push it into the pool. But I can also rotate it by just carefully selecting the little planar arc. But I'm thinking that's a bit big. So one of the things that I can do is, if you'll notice, right in the middle of the screen is a move icon or translate. If whilst my object is selected, if I hit the shift key, that icon changes to rotate. And if I hit the shift key again, it changes to scale. And the little indicators on the gizmo have changed. And I can scale it in any one of these axes. So I can just pick an axis and squash it. But if I pick the middle one and drag it up or down, it uniformly scales the object. And not forgetting that if I want to rotate or move it, I have to go back. And maybe I just want to push that slightly below the water. You can change the transparency of the water, but I quite like the black pool, so we'll just go with that because it gives me those reflections. Now, how are we doing? We're going to talk about plants because that's probably what you're interested in developing. Now, I've got a lawn here, and my lawn has got this board around it because I created an offset in SketchUp and I gave two colors, a unique color to each area, because I want the middle ground to be a tall wild grass. But knowing how Twinmotion works, what is going to happen is those grasses sort of stick out in all directions. And if it gets too close to an edge, those grasses start to pop up through the surrounding paving. So what I want to do is set the grass in, and then I can paint a smaller, more detailed grass. You remember that we had a detailed grass option on the outside, and then I can merge the base texture. So if I go into my library, I'm going to go into grasses, and I've got a whole load of different grasses. These are not textures, these are three-dimensional grasses. So this is something you could never do in SketchUp. You can use scatter in SketchUp, but you don't actually see the results. You've got to look at a proxy render, whether that's Enscape or V-Ray. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick you can pick a range of grasses. So I'm going to pick, let's say, a wild grass. Whoops, let's go wild grass again. Sorry, I'm not in the paint mode, that's why. So I'm going to go to context, which is my little building and plant icon symbol. And I've got a choice. I can paint vegetation or I can scatter it. And here I just want all of this area to be with the same grass. So I'm going to scatter. So now I pick scatter and then I drag my grasses into this area. So I'm going to drag a dry grass and a wild grass and maybe a tall grass. These are quite tall. So one's very dense. This one's not very dense. You can see little picture with the football and it's not got many grasses. This one's the same, but it has lots of tufts. So maybe we'll go with this one. Now I'm going to pick the first, hold down the shift and pick all three. And then I'm going to hit this little paint bucket here, which has got the plus symbol, and I'm going to click on my texture. And you'll notice it applies an amount of that material. And immediately you'll see that it's starting to intrude into that bounding different green box that I put in place, but it's not going any further. If I want it to be denser, I click again. And if I want it to be denser, I click again. And maybe a third time, maybe even a fourth time. Now, there is some nice technology inside Twinmotion, which is if I zoom out, my grass disappears because it is almost impossible for the computer to render that level of detail from that far away. But as I zoom in, it starts to apply that detail. So don't think that somehow your models have been wiped out, because they haven't. This will always appear in your rendering when you export. So it's just an on-screen function. So having applied my grass, I'm now going to apply a different grass to the outside. So maybe in this case, I'm going to pick a detailed grass. So I'm going to go up. I'm going to go to detailed grasses. And these are grasses that really try to obey the geometry in a little bit better fashion. So here I'm going to pick this grass. I'm going to pick my scatter, and I'm going to click only the, there we go. So now I'm only applying that detailed grass to the outside. Now, having done that, I've still got these two textures that I painted on. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go back up to my materials, I'm going to go back to ground, and I'm going to go to nature, and I can paint on a general grass texture that hides this underlying, so maybe I'll pick a dryish grass texture. There we go. And there we go. So Twinmotion just crashed. And that was because I was trying to do lots of things that were too clever for it. So I'm going to just get that up and running. An easy way to get it up and running is I could go and open it all up, but probably the best way is from within the SketchUp model. So I'm going to go back to my SketchUp model. I'm going to open up Twinmotion. And we were doing so well, we'd gone nearly an hour. So it's an existing project, so I'm going to say OK. And I'm just going to go make sure that I think I put that onto my desktop. And that was probably the last. And there it is. And here we go. And you'll notice that in my keenness, I didn't save after I put the trees in. So we're going to have to go back. I could repeat it, but I'm very conscious of time. So I'm not going to reset all of those things. But hopefully you get the idea. There's another couple of functions that are really useful in terms of planting. So I'm going to plant up some of these beds. Let's just get the SketchUp from behind. So I'm going to go and back to my context menu. Oops, seems to have locked. Right, that's better. And this time I'm going to paint. Well, I'll do a bit of vegetation scatter, and then I'm going to paint. So I'm going to go to my vegetation scatter, and it's asking me what do I want to scatter. Last thing I was in was grasses, but this time I want to go to plants. So I've got a range of plants here. So I've got some ferns. I've got common fern too. I've got a base bush, which I know is a smallish bush, and then lots of ferns in here. I don't think we need any more ferns from Twinmotion. I've got some various iris type plants, and that's it. We've got water lilies that we can add. Little rose bush is quite useful. So if I select those plants, I click the first one, click the last one, and then I can hit vegetation scatter. I'm just going to hit this light area here. And there we go. It immediately populates all of those areas with plants. And in this case, I'm going to add it to this one as well. and it adds it at the ratio on the right-hand side. I can pick a density for each of these, but usually I'm really just trying to create an indication that there are plants. And let's just add and repeat that again. And if you do it, a second time, it adds them with, it doubles the density. And if I zoom in, just so that, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. And I'm sure everybody's screaming at me to save, so I'm going to File, Save. Grass is what I find causes the problems because there's so much geometry, and I should have created and put the grass into its own container, its own folder straight away. So we've got lots of, plants. Again, I would hide this vegetation, this green color underneath by giving it a texture. And as you do these things, you get favorite textures. So on planted areas, I call this like grassy ground because it's got a little bit of grass in it. It sort of looks like soil with a moss inside. So that looks pretty good. And maybe you might have put in less bushes and some, more of the perennials. There are not many flowering plants in Twinmotion. That's probably my other criticism of it. It could do with more garden relating plants rather than landscape relating plants. But I've probably presented these sorts of images to about 10 clients, and they've all completely ignored the fact that the plants that are in here are not representative. They're just bowled over by the ability to see the space. Now, I mentioned right at the beginning that we've got this background that is really nothing to do with the context of this site. So what I'm going to do is start painting in some trees. And I don't need to paint within the garden. We're just adding vegetation because it blocks out the background. And this particular site happens to have lots of trees around it anyway. So I'm going to zoom out more from an aerial point of view, and maybe just move myself over and rotate it round. And I'm now going to go back to my context, and this time we're going to paint in some vegetation. And it's, big arrow indicates put some plants in. So I'm just going to, and we crashed again. And I should have put the plants in, but anyway, let's go. So I expected this to happen. I apologize. And it's not really the Twinmotion issue. It's the Twinmotion plus broadcasting, and putting the two together does cause a problem. So it's an existing project. And let me go find that on my desktop. There it is. Okay, so obviously the last thing I did wasn't say, oh, it was saved. It automatically saved. So let me get rid of the website in the background. So obviously what I need to do is save myself just to make sure that that wasn't a fluke. And I can, if I go on the right-hand side and drag all the way to the bottom, you can see that it's got scatter vegetation, and that's simply one category. Whilst I selected lots of plants, it's put all of them into a single group. And if I switch those off, then hopefully I'm helping relieve a little bit of the burden. So what I was about to show you was, let's get into more of an aerial point of view. Zoom out the other way. I seem to have lost the little container that had all my trees in. So I'm just going to switch off those trees in particular. But what I'm going to do now is paint some trees around the garden, just to give me a background. So I'm going to go into my context. I'm going to paint vegetation, and I'm going to drag some trees, and hopefully it's going to behave. So maybe I'll have some pines. I'm going to have maybe a plane tree, and you don't need to go overboard. Again, these I don't think I need a guava. I was just looking for something that was quite distinctive. Italian stone pine looks good, and maybe something, maybe an Aleppo pine. Okay, so I can then pick. You'll notice that I can choose the relative density of this tree, not relative to other trees, but how much of that tree is going to occupy, paint itself into the paintbrush. So let's start off with 30%. I can always increase this afterwards. So I'm going to pick all of these trees, and I'm going to hit paint. And I'm going to change the diameter of my brush to be quite big. And now I can paint around my object. So I'm just going to paint around. Again, any smaller vegetation is sort of rendered in little tiny green triangles. And it's randomly applied a tree at a height. So some of them are big, some of them are small. And if I go into maybe my settings, I can change. In this case, I think these were the Austrian pines, but when I slide them up and down, it's changing only the Austrian pines, and so I'm changing the age of that particular tree. So maybe if I didn't quite get the density correct, then I can play around with them individually. If I go back to my images, I'm not sure whether I've still got my first image in, and I just happen to have set it so that it was in the middle of a tree. And for some reason, let me just do a file save. Okay, so this is the image that I set up right at the beginning, but probably what I want to do is something, well, maybe just down here. If I want to change that image, then I've got a little recapture icon at the top, and that changes the image. So the thing I would start to do now, knowing that we have not got a huge amount of time, is I'd start to set up the images that I want. So this looks fine, but maybe my the sunlight is a bit harsh. So underneath the image is a little more button, and I got location. And if I can go to location, I could actually put the location of the garden in. I almost never do, but I can play around with things like north. So I can change where the sun's coming from. So I might want something like this that's putting quite a lot of light on the building, got some nice defining shadows, and the trees look quite good. I can change the month of the year. So, February gives me a nice low light, and then as I move further through the year, so maybe I want something that looks like that, and then I can change the time of day. Now, what happens is you'll notice the sun's moving through the sky, and you can start to get some nice sort of effects. So if I've got the sun in that position, then maybe I'm going to change my north. You get the idea. You basically adjusting things so that they look quite good. I'm just going to come back from that, and I'm going to go back into more, and maybe I'm going to change the weather. So I can play around with whether it's, I start to get some buildup of clouds, which adds a little bit more interest in the sky. And these are dynamic clouds. They move. So I can put lots of weather in here, so I can actually make it rain. You'll see there's rain applied, or I can just adjust it so that I've got a bit of cloud, but I've got a wet ground, so maybe I'll just have some wetness on the ground, like it's just Then I can play around with seasons. So at the moment we're in, a summery season. Now, as I'm moving my slider, these trees are dynamic. You'll notice they're changing color. And it's crashed again. So here we go. Right. Won't take a few seconds to reload. I would usually expect it to crash once in a project, and particularly the more stuff you start adding. So I'm going to go with existing project. Let's drag that over. There we go. My own fault. I should have saved every 5 seconds, but I didn't. So my trees are switched off. I'm back to just having the plants, but it has remembered that we've got trees in the background, so that's not bad. So let me just reinforce that with another save, and then I'll get on to doing some night shots. If I go down to my media, let's see what we've got in terms of saved images. So if I click that one, so what I just want to do is come through the tree and maybe just zoom around a bit, pull out. And so what I'm going to do there is recapture, and I'm going to save this. Right. Okay. Now, what we can do is start to add some light. So I've put some positions for lights, which I just created in SketchUp, just little spheres in the right location above my table and chairs. And I've got this swan neck, and we may not get to do any more. So what I want to do is, first of all, I'm going to create a new image. So this is a repeat, and I'm going to change this by going to more, and I'm going to change under location. I'm going to change time of day, and I'm just going to slide it all the way down to, this is about 8 o'clock at night in July, so I'm going to go really late. Let's go 11, 12 o'clock. What it actually does is it gives you, and I've got no idea where I'm getting lighting effects from. Okay, it's stabilized. It sort of gives you night, but you can still see the model. And it doesn't happen instantly. It's got this gradual fade to it. And you'll notice that even as I'm speaking, it's changed a little bit. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go back into my library. Before I go any further, I'm just going to recapture that. And I'm going to go into lights. And we've got these IES numbers. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, the lower the number, the less strong the light. And we've got lots of other things like omnidirectional lights, but probably something like IES3 might be a good point. And I'm literally going to drag the light and I'm going to place it into or onto the swan neck light. So maybe just about there. And you can see you get this sort of cone of vision for the light. So, and what I want to do is change that. It's far too bright and it's far too wide. So I can change the angle. So I'm just going to play around with the angle of light. So maybe I need to lift that light up a bit. So just drag it up the wall. Maybe about here. And I'm going to change the intensity, and you can play around with the slider, but you need to get quite low. So what you can do with all of these is actually just click on them and manually adjust them. So if I just type in 50 and hit return, I get a much lower, and maybe I'm probably going to go 20. So maybe 20 is okay. There's a little button right across that says shadows, and if I click on shadows, then shadows means that the light will cast a shadow. And you can't really see it here, but you might be able to when we go onto the table. So I'm just going to go over to my table. And I can just about see one of my lights. So I'm going to go back to my light library, maybe pick something, I don't know, IES 7, see what that does. And I can just, there we go. It's now sitting on that sphere. And if I do exactly the same as I did before, which is click on that and hit the shift key, I'm dragging a copy of it. And it will say, do I want an instance? And yes, because when I change one, which is what I'm about to do, the other one will change at the same rate. So maybe I don't want it to be quite so broad, and maybe I want to reduce that down to, what does 100 look like? So maybe I've got something quite subtle. I'm going to go back to my media, back to my images, and then what I'm going to do is make sure I'm going to recapture all of that. And this time I'm just going to make sure that I save it. But because I'm not playing with grasses and plants, it seems to not be wanting to crash out so much. So maybe I'll just add one more, which is an uplight to a tree, because that's always quite dramatic. You can add them underwater. Let me go into, let's go and add an IES3. And these are a bit tricky in that I immediately realized I hadn't placed it anywhere in the right zone. So let's just drag that underneath the tree. And it's okay. So my light is under the tree at the moment. And what I want to do is rotate it. So it's pointing down. I want it to rotate up. So if I go to the moment it was translation, so now I want it on rotation. And if I click on here and type 180, try again. Oops. Hit return. Now it's pointing up into my tree. And maybe my angle is just a bit too steep. And maybe my intensity needs to come down a fraction. Maybe that's a bit too subtle. Oh, 1, I meant to type 100. 1. So maybe that's a bit better. And these little gizmos, you can see they identify the location of the light, but they won't be present when you render out. So you end up with something a little bit. And you can't do this in, obviously, SketchUp. And so just for the ability to add really great plants and do night shots, I think it's worth the effort. The other thing that maybe I'm hoping is coming across is the level of interface is really simple. You can do quite amazing things, and you can grunge up some of the textures, and you can put debris in, and it can suddenly start to look really realistic if you choose your lighting and such like correctly. But those are techniques that once you understand where the fundamental switches and sliders are, then you can start to play around with them. Now, I'm going to take some questions at the end. So what I'm going to really wrap up this quick demonstration, but I'm just going to show you how to export. If I go into my media, I've got 2 images. We can do videos and panoramics and all sorts of things, but we've got 2 images. They're relatively similar. I just make sure I recapture that one. So I've got this image and I've got this image. And it will settle down in a second. So what I'm going to do is export them. And if I go right to the bottom, there's a button that says export. Just right at the top, there's one called import. So most of the things that you're going to do are on the 3 middle buttons. So I'm going to go right to the bottom and say export. And I'm exporting images. So if I go to the image folder and I've got 2 images in here, I'm going to select all of them. And then I'm going to go all the way across and say start export. I set mine a default export, which is a high resolution. I'm just going to go and put them into I'll put them onto my desktop so that they're in the same location and say select. and it's going to start exporting. So these are going to go as pretty high resolution. You can go very ultra high resolution, but if you're going to go up to about A3, you really don't need to go that high. And this will take, I'm hoping, about 2 minutes. So this little window will hopefully give me an estimated time, but it usually catches up really quickly. Here we go, 26 seconds left. So again, if I was doing this with SketchUp and I was exporting from layout, for instance, I might as well go and have a bath, because it can take 15, 20, 30 minutes if you've got a lot of plants. As soon as these have completed, I will go and open them. So there we go. I'm going to go and open up that folder that, let me just drag over, go to my desktop, and right. So there is the first image. So I think that's pretty good. The plants are rendered. I could have maybe added more detail in, some clouds in the sky. But if I was designing a pergola and a seating area with a pond and some general plants, then I think that gives a good representation. And let's just drag the second image over. Oops. And here it is. A bit harsh on my lights, so I think I had the intensity set too high. The outside seating area works well. You can create fire pits and pizza ovens that look like there's a flame and it's glowing. You could add people into your shots. There's a whole library of characters that are both animated and static. And creating a video is really just a case of creating a one of those scenes with one particular view, and then you create another scene at a different point of view. And so you rotate yourself around, and Twinmotion will create the motion between the 2 points. But that's covered a lot with lots of the online tutorials. Okay, we didn't crash too much, and I'm hoping that didn't interfere too much with your understanding of Twinmotion. If anybody's got any questions, then I'll be very happy to answer them.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. It's Lauren from Tech. Thank you for joining us today. We have about 10 minutes left, so please use your panel box to ask any questions here and now for Paul. And if we don't get to any, feel free to email afterwards. We've got one here for already, Paul, and it's from Richard. Hi, Richard. He's asking, have you compared a render from V-Ray to Twinmotion, and if so, which is better? I guess I could just add that as well, Paul, because obviously there's an array of rendering solutions for SketchUp, and obviously we don't expect you to have used them all, but if you maybe just want to have a little chat about sort of the differences between them and what you find best.
Well, the first consideration is what kind of machine you're using, because if you're using a Mac, then your render options are very limited. Twinmotion and not much else. Things like Lumion, V-Ray. I know V-Ray does work on a Mac, V-Ray Next, but Lumion, Enscape, all of those don't. So you're really down to Twinmotion or V-Ray. Now, V-Ray and Twinmotion are slightly different beasts. V-Ray is a pure render engine and creates static images. So you set up a static image and it creates a very nice sort of rendered. If you then rotate the object, you have to then recreate that. And you can sort of do, you can't create this live rendered point of view. And that's what Twinmotion is particularly good at. You might see lots of complaints saying that Twinmotion uses a gaming engine and therefore it doesn't treat textures in the same way. I'm a very small outfit, and I have to do all of the computing work. I have to do the survey, the computer modeling, the detailed modeling, the visualizations. I really don't want to spend a day doing a visualization, and I really don't care if it's a true physical-based rendering that V-Ray does, or it just looks really good as it does with Twinmotion. To me, my clients think that the output from SketchUp is amazing, and the output from Twinmotion is just way beyond their expectations anyway. So unless I was into being a professional architectural visualizer, then I'm very satisfied with the output from Twinmotion. I also think that the interface is much better. In fact, it's probably one of the best interfaces. Now, how does a V-Ray and a Twinmotion render compare? You'd probably notice if they were side by side, but I don't think that's a true representation, because Twinmotion does lots of other things. And on the video side, it is by far the best of all the renders, because you can create these walkthrough videos it will process them within minutes. And then if you send those to clients, the client can execute them, and that is almost invaluable. And I'm finding that clients are asking for renders in a way that they never asked for 6 months ago. So I'm not sure that absolutely answers your question, but I think it's as much a need as and a desire as it is about the quality of the output.
Yes, I definitely, I'd agree with that as well. Richard has said, yes, that does answer the question,
Okay.
but that was nicely explained. Thanks, Paul. One more question coming in here from Sue. Hello, Sue. Asking, what size are the exported images at resolutions okay for A3?
Okay, I will just open up my file and get the info, and the image. Those images that you saw, I'll just bring one of them back. That is 3.4 megabytes. So it's a really decent quality. And if I'm just going to see if I can access the, bear with me. So I'm just trying to wake Twinmotion up, but I'm going to see if I can find out what resolution I'm going with. So this was a 1920 by 1080. So this is a 2K quality image. It works really well. If you take them, I find that sometimes I do little bits of post-production. You end up with a leaf sticking out of a window or something that just needs a tweak to it. So they sometimes go into Photoshop and they respond really well, and you can see the level of the resolution in things like Photoshop. But you can go higher. I can go to 4K output, and I can do the same with video. But the problem is the file size gets really large, and it becomes difficult to start integrating those into other packages. Or frequently, I will do my visualizations in Twinmotion. I will do the output as a 3 or a 4 megabyte file, and then I simply take that file and drop it into layout. And most of my layouts are set up at A3 or A2, and so I put one image per sheet. And that image is actually lower in memory size than if I had brought in a fully planted with shadows and texture image into layout from SketchUp. It's also much quicker.
Great. Thank you. Hope that answered the question, Sue. I think it did. We haven't got any more questions coming in at the moment, unless someone. Yeah, no, that's it. Just Sue saying thank you. Yeah. So yeah, we've got one question coming in. Okay, bear with us 1 second. We'll have time for just one question. Just to once again reiterate everyone that the session has been recorded, and Almtech will be sending out an email tomorrow morning linking you to the recording should you want to watch it again at leisure. We've also partnered with one of our resellers and Paul's reseller, actually, CADSoft Solutions, who are offering half price on Twinmotion, plus if you want to purchase SketchUp as well, they have a special deal on for attendees. Okay, so we've got a question here from Himmel. Hi, Himmel. Surrounding of this modeling, need to put real life landscape of building, for example, this location where the model is, need to add light rounding is
you
possible.
do that, but you do that in SketchUp. You use the geolocation function inside SketchUp, and that will bring in a piece of a terrain. And initially that looks like it's two-dimensional, but if you go into your layer or tag structure, you'll notice that there are two new layers or tags, and one of them is 3D terrain, and it will create, or it will show you inside SketchUp the terrain for the context of the postcode that you've inserted and where you created your building or your garden. So that would come into Twinmotion as part of the SketchUp model. It will be flat, so you then will have to, not flats, but it won't have any trees or plants. It will be a three-dimensional terrain. So you'll then have to populate it with some vegetation or maybe some just context buildings, some cubes, or really simple primitives. But yes, you do all of the geometry creation inside SketchUp, and you assemble the objects into the space inside Twinmotion. So the trees, the plants, the lights, but you're only painting existing surfaces.
Right, okay. Great, I hope that answers the question. I think it did, Himmel. I think we've come to the end now. So I shall pass over to Paul to say thank you and goodbye.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has them, either on SketchUp or Twinmotion. But a really good resource to build on this is the YouTube channel. Twinmotion has a YouTube channel, but if you type in Twinmotion, then there'll be lots of tutorials. And some of them are really advanced, but most of them take you into detailed aspects of one aspect. And there's some nice ones coming up on the use of vegetation, I know, done by Twinmotion. So you can maybe use those to explore your interest a bit further. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that I will have your pleasure in a future webinar.
Thanks, Paul. Bye, everyone.